Part 1. The concept of the collective unconscious. What is the unconscious? Before we can understand the collective unconscious, we need to grasp what psychologists mean by the unconscious in general. In everyday life, we are aware of only a tiny fraction of our mental activity. We have conscious thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that we can describe and reflect upon. But beneath this conscious awareness lies a vast realm of mental processes that influence our behavior, emotions, and thoughts without our being directly aware of them. Think of an iceberg. The part above water represents our conscious mind, the thoughts and feelings we're aware of. The much larger portion below the surface represents the unconscious, all the mental activity happening outside our awareness. This includes memories we've forgotten, desires we've suppressed, instincts that drive our behavior, and patterns of thought and emotion that shape our experience without our realizing it. Sigmund Freud, Jung's early mentor and collaborator, focused primarily on what Jung would call the personal unconscious, the repository of an individual's forgotten or repressed experiences, particularly from childhood. Freud believed that neurosis and psychological suffering arose primarily from traumatic experiences or forbidden desires that had been pushed out of conscious awareness, but continued to affect behavior from the shadows. Jung's revolutionary discovery. Jung's great contribution was to recognize that beneath the personal unconscious lies an even deeper layer, one that is not unique to the individual, but is shared by all human beings. Jung called this deeper layer the collective unconscious. It is collective because its contents are universal, belonging to humanity as a whole rather than to any particular person. How did Jung come to this conclusion? Several lines of evidence converged. In his clinical work with patients, Jung noticed that their dreams, fantasies, and delusions often contained images and themes that seemed to come from nowhere in their personal experience. Patients with no knowledge of mythology would produce dreams filled with mythological motifs. People from entirely different cultural backgrounds would describe remarkably similar inner experiences. Jung also conducted extensive research into the myths, religions, and symbols of cultures around the world. He was struck by the astonishing parallels between mythological themes across cultures that had no historical contact with one another. The hero's journey, the Great Mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the cosmic tree, the sacred marriage, these and many other themes appeared again and again in the mythology of peoples who could not possibly have borrowed them from one another. One famous case that helped convince Jung of the collective unconscious involved a patient at the Burgosli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. This patient, during a psychotic episode, described a vision of a tube hanging from the sun, from which the wind blew. Years later, Jung came across a nearly identical image in an ancient Mithraic liturgy that the patient could not possibly have known about. Such coincidences, too frequent and too specific to be mere chance, suggested to Jung that there existed a layer of the psyche containing universal images and patterns. The nature of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is not something we acquire through learning or personal experience. It is, Jung argued, inherited. Just as our bodies have evolved over millions of years and carry the marks of that evolution, so too has our psyche evolved and carries within it the accumulated experience of our species. The collective unconscious is the psychological equivalent of the body's evolutionary heritage. Jung was careful to clarify what he meant by this inheritance. The collective unconscious does not contain specific images, memories, or ideas that are passed down from generation to generation. Rather, it contains what Jung called archetypes, predispositions, or potentials for certain types of experience and imagery. Think of it like the instincts that animals are born with. A spider doesn't learn how to spin a web. It is born with the capacity and tendency to do so. Similarly, humans are born with psychological predispositions, tendencies to form certain types of images, to have certain types of experiences, to organize our perception of the world in certain ways. The archetypes themselves are not images, but rather forms without content, patterns, or templates that shape experience, but have no specific content until they are activated in an individual's life. When an archetype is activated by life circumstances, developmental stages, or intense emotional experiences, it produces specific images, symbols, and feelings in the individual's conscious and unconscious experience. An analogy might help. Think of the archetypes as the crystal lattice structure that determines how salt crystals will form. The structure itself is invisible, but when salt solution evaporates, crystals form according to that predetermined pattern. The specific crystals are unique each time, but they all share the same underlying structure. Similarly, archetypal images vary across individuals and cultures, but they all derive from the same underlying archetypal patterns. Evidence for the collective unconscious. Jung offered several types of evidence for the existence of the collective unconscious. First, as mentioned, there is the remarkable similarity of mythological themes across unconnected cultures. The flood myth, the dying and resurrecting god, the descent to the underworld, the world tree, these appear in cultures from every continent and from every period of history. Second, there is the evidence from dreams. Jung and his followers documented countless cases of patients dreaming of images and symbols that had clear parallels in mythology and religion, but that the dreamers could not have learned from their personal experience. A modern person with no knowledge of ancient Egyptian religion might dream of images strikingly similar to those found in Egyptian tomb paintings. Third, there is the evidence from psychopathology. Patients suffering from psychotic episodes often produce a rich flow of fantasy material hallucinations, delusions, and bizarre ideation that frequently contains archetypal themes. Jung saw psychosis as, in part, an overwhelming of the ego by contents from the collective unconscious. Fourth, and perhaps most accessible for most people, is the evidence from children. Children who have not yet been heavily influenced by cultural learning often spontaneously produce drawings, fantasies, and games that contain clearly archetypal themes: dragons, wise helpers, magical transformations, heroes, and villains. Finally, there is the experiential evidence. When Jung describes the archetypes and how they manifest, many readers recognize something in their own experience. The images and patterns Jung describes resonate because they touch something universal in human nature. Part 2. The archetypes' universal patterns of the psyche. Defining the archetypes. The word archetype comes from the Greek archetypos, meaning first molded or original pattern. Jung adopted this term to describe the universal patterns or templates that exist in the collective unconscious and shape human experience. The concept has ancient roots. Plato's forms or ideas are a philosophical precursor, but Jung gave it a specifically psychological meaning. It is crucial to understand what archetypes are not. They are not specific images, stories, or symbols. They are not inherited memories or ideas. They are not cultural constructs that we learn from our society. Rather, archetypes are predispositions, inherited tendencies to form certain types of images and to have certain types of experiences. They are the invisible structures that shape the visible products of the human imagination. Jung often compared archetypes to instincts. Just as instincts are inherited patterns of behavior that emerge automatically under the right conditions, archetypes are inherited patterns of psychological experience that emerge when the right conditions are present. A baby doesn't need to be taught to suckle. The instinct is there from birth. Similarly, humans don't need to be taught to form images of the mother, the father, the hero, or the shadow. These archetypal patterns are part of our psychological inheritance. How archetypes manifest. While archetypes themselves are invisible and unknowable, they belong to the collective unconscious, which by definition lies beyond conscious awareness. They manifest in consciousness through specific images, symbols, emotions, and behaviors. These manifestations Jung called archetypal images or archetypal representations. An archetype is like a riverbed that shapes the flow of water without itself being the water. The riverbed archetype remains constant, but the water, specific images, and experiences that flows through it varies according to circumstances. Different cultures, different individuals, different historical periods will fill in the archetypal patterns with different specific content, but the underlying patterns remain the same. For example, the mother archetype, the pattern underlying the human experience of mother, manifests differently in different contexts. In one culture, the Great Mother might appear as the Virgin Mary, in another, as Isis, in another, as Kali. In an individual's dream, the mother archetype might appear as the dreamer's actual mother, as an unknown woman, as a cave, as the sea, or as any of countless other images that carry the felt sense of motherness, nurturing, containing, giving birth, but also potentially devouring or smothering. Archetypes manifest in several domains of human experience. They appear in dreams, often as numinous or particularly powerful images that seem to carry a special charge or significance. They appear in mythology and religion, where they form the basis of the gods, heroes, and cosmic dramas that cultures tell and retell. They appear in art and literature, where they provide the deep structures that give stories their universal appeal. They appear in psychopathology, where their invasion of consciousness can contribute to delusions and hallucinations. And they appear in everyday life, in our projections onto others, our spontaneous fantasies, and the patterns that shape our relationships and life choices. The numinous quality of archetypes. One of the most striking features of archetypal experience is its numinous quality. Jung borrowed the term numinous from the theologian Rudolf Otto, who used it to describe the experience of the holy or sacred, an experience marked by feelings of awe, mystery, tremendous power, and fascination. When an archetype is activated, the resulting experience often has this numinous quality. It feels deeply significant, even if the person cannot explain why. Think of a dream that stays with you for years, one that felt more real than real, charged with meaning you can't quite articulate. Or think of an experience of falling in love when another person seems to glow with an almost supernatural light and significance. Or think of the feeling evoked by certain works of art or music, or by standing in a great cathedral or ancient temple. These are experiences of the numinous, and Jung argued that they arise from the activation of archetypes. The numinous quality of archetypes explains both their power and their danger. When an archetype is activated, tremendous psychic energy is released. This energy can be a source of creativity, meaning, and transformation. But it can also be overwhelming, especially if the ego is not strong enough to contain it. Jung saw much of psychopathology as resulting from an ego overwhelmed by archetypal energies that it could not integrate. Major archetypes in Jung's system. While Jung believed that the number of archetypes is potentially unlimited, there are as many archetypal patterns as there are typical human situations. He gave particular attention to several major archetypes that play central roles in psychological development. These include the shadow, the anima and animus, the self, the mother, the father, the child, the wise old man, the trickster, the hero, and the persona. The wise old man. The wise old man or woman archetype represents wisdom, guidance, and superior knowledge. In mythology and fairy tales, this figure often appears as a wizard, sage, guru, hermit, or mentor who provides crucial help to the hero at a decisive moment. Think of Gandalf in Lord of the Rings or Dumbledore in Harry Potter. In dreams, the wise old man might appear as an elderly figure who offers advice or shows the way. He represents the self's guidance function, the wisdom of the unconscious, that can direct the ego when it is lost or confused. Encountering this archetype in dreams often signals that one needs to seek deeper wisdom, to look beyond the ego's limited perspective. The wise old man also has a shadow side, the negative senex who represents not wisdom but rigidity, dogmatism, and the tyranny of the past over the present. The wise old man who becomes the manipulative old man, using his knowledge for power rather than guidance, represents this dark aspect. The trickster. The trickster is one of the oldest and most widespread archetypal figures, appearing in the mythology of virtually every culture. He is Coyote in Native American tales, Anansi the spider in African folklore, Loki in Norse mythology, Hermes in Greek tradition. The trickster is cunning, amoral, shape-shifting, and often obscene. He breaks rules, crosses boundaries, and turns things upside down. Psychologically, the trickster represents the part of the psyche that refuses to be bound by convention, that mocks pretension, and undermines the ego's attempts at control. He is associated with unexpected changes, creative chaos, and the disruption of established patterns. While he can be destructive, he is also associated with innovation and the breaking of stale forms. The trickster often appears in dreams during times of transition or when the conscious attitude has become too rigid. His appearance suggests a need for flexibility, for not taking oneself too seriously, for allowing the unexpected to enter one's life. The hero. The hero archetype represents the ego's capacity to confront challenges, overcome obstacles, and achieve transformation. The hero's journey separation from the ordinary world, initiation through trials, and return with a boon is one of the most universal story patterns, found in myths from every culture. Joseph Campbell, building on Jung's work, outlined the hero's journey in his influential book The Hero with 1,000 Faces. The pattern involves the hero receiving a call to adventure, crossing a threshold into an unknown world, facing trials and temptations, achieving a central ordeal, gaining a reward, and returning transformed to the ordinary world to share what they have gained. Psychologically, the hero represents the ego's necessary struggle to differentiate from the unconscious and establish itself in the world. Every person must be a hero in their own life, facing the challenges of development and growth. But the hero's journey is only the first half of life's work. In the second half, a different pattern emerges, one of integration and return to wholeness rather than differentiation and conquest. In the essays collected in Part 1 of Volume 9, Jung focuses particularly on the mother archetype, the child archetype, including the core or maiden, and to some extent the shadow, anima or animus, and self. We will examine each of these in detail in the following sections. Understanding these archetypes is not merely an academic exercise. It is a practical tool for understanding ourselves and others at a deeper level. Part 3. The Mother Archetype, the Great Mother, Universal Pattern of Nurturing and Life. Of all the archetypes, the mother is perhaps the most fundamental and powerful. Every human being has a mother. Every human being has had the experience of being completely dependent on another being for survival. This universal human experience has, over countless generations, shaped a deep archetypal pattern in the human psyche. The mother archetype is not simply an image of one's personal mother, though the personal mother is obviously the first carrier of this archetype for each individual. Rather, it is a primordial pattern that shapes all experiences of motherness, nurturing, protection, fertility, abundance, the origin and source of life, but also in its negative aspect, devouring, smothering, deprivation, and death. Throughout human history and across all cultures, the mother archetype has found expression in countless goddess figures. Isis in Egypt, Demeter and Gaia in Greece, Kali and Parvati in India, the Virgin Mary in Christianity, Guanyin in Buddhism. These divine feminine figures share certain essential qualities. They give life, they nurture, they protect, even though the specific imagery and stories vary enormously across cultures. Symbols of the mother archetype. The mother archetype expresses itself through a rich variety of symbols. Some are personal and human, the actual mother, grandmother, stepmother, mother-in-law, nurse. Some are figurative, the church, the university, the country, the city. Jung notes that the church is often called Mother Church, and countries are called motherland or fatherland. More abstract and symbolic representations include anything that contains, embraces, nourishes, or protects: the womb, the cave, the vessel, the oven, the garden, the sea, the earth. The forest, especially in fairy tales, often represents the realm of the Great Mother, a place of both danger and transformation. Water in its many forms, ocean, lake, river, spring, carries maternal symbolism across cultures. Animals associated with the mother archetype include the cow, sacred in many cultures as a giver of milk, the bear, fierce protector of her young, the hen, and various creatures associated with fertility and the earth. In some cultures, serpents and dragons, beings of the underworld and the earth, carry maternal symbolism, particularly in their devouring aspect. Even certain shapes and forms evoke the mother archetype: anything hollow or vessel-like, anything round and containing. The mandala, the sacred circle, often carries maternal associations as an image of wholeness and containment. The dual nature of the mother. One of Jung's most important insights is that archetypes are ambivalent. They have both positive and negative aspects. The mother archetype is perhaps the clearest example of this dual nature. In her positive aspect, the Great Mother represents all that is nurturing, life-giving, protecting, and sustaining. She is the source of life, the provider of nourishment, the warm embrace that keeps us safe. She is the womb from which we emerge and the earth to which we return. She represents abundance, fertility, unconditional love, and the security of home. But the mother archetype also has a dark side, which Jung calls the terrible mother. In this aspect, she is devouring, engulfing, smothering, and destructive. She is the mother who won't let her children grow up, who keeps them bound to her, who suffocates them with her love. She is the dark goddess who demands sacrifice, the witch who eats children, the dragon who guards the treasure. She represents the pull back toward unconsciousness, the seduction of regression, the desire to return to the womb and avoid the challenges of life. This duality appears clearly in mythology. The goddess Kali in Hinduism is perhaps the most vivid representation. She is the mother who gives birth to all life, but also the fierce destroyer, depicted with a garland of skulls, her tongue dripping with blood. Even the gentle Virgin Mary has her dark counterpart in medieval legends, the Black Madonna, associated with the earth, death, and transformation. In fairy tales, this duality often appears as the split between the good mother, often dead, and the wicked stepmother. The good mother represents the nurturing aspect. The stepmother represents the devouring aspect. Psychologically, this split reflects the child's difficulty in reconciling the loving mother who feeds and comforts with the frustrating mother who denies and disappoints. The mother complex. When the mother archetype is activated in an individual's psyche, combined with their actual experiences with their personal mother, the result is what Jung calls the mother complex. Everyone has a mother complex. It is part of normal psychological development. The question is not whether one has a mother complex, but what form it takes and how it affects one's life. A mother complex can take many forms. In a son, it might manifest as an overly dependent relationship with women, an unconscious search for the ideal mother in romantic partners, or, conversely, a fear and avoidance of women and intimacy. In a daughter, it might appear as identification with the mother, either positive, I want to be just like her, or negative, I will be nothing like her, or as ongoing competition and conflict. Jung describes several typical effects of the mother complex in women. Some daughters become overwhelmed by the maternal instinct to the exclusion of other aspects of their personality. Their entire identity becomes that of the mother. Others develop the opposite pattern, becoming identified with the negative mother, cold, rejecting, unable to nurture. Still others become bound to the mother in a way that inhibits their development of an independent identity. Understanding one's mother complex is an important part of psychological development. It means recognizing how the archetypal pattern has combined with personal experience to shape one's attitudes, emotions, and behaviors, particularly in relation to nurturing, dependency, intimacy, and one's own capacity to care for others. Part 4. The Child Archetype. The Divine Child, symbol of potential and renewal. The child archetype represents not biological childhood, but the psychological experience of beginnings, potential, and the possibility of new life. It is the archetype of what might be, of fresh starts, of the capacity for growth and transformation. Jung calls it the divine child because in mythology and religion, the child figure often represents something sacred, a savior, a hero, a new god. Think of the Christmas story. The divine child born in humble circumstances who will transform the world. Or think of the many mythological heroes who begin their stories as miraculous children, Moses in the bulrushes, Hercules strangling serpents in his cradle, the Buddha taking 7 steps at birth and declaring his enlightenment. The child archetype carries this sense of miraculous potential and destiny. In an individual's psychology, the child archetype represents the part of us that remains open to new possibilities, that has not yet been rigidified by habit and expectation, that can still wonder and imagine. It is the source of creativity, playfulness, and spontaneity. When we say someone has the wonder of a child or has remained young at heart, we are recognizing the presence of this archetype. Characteristics of the child archetype. Jung identifies several characteristic features of the child archetype as it appears in mythology and dreams. First, the divine child is often born in lowly or humble circumstances in a stable, in the wilderness, hidden away from danger. This lowliness represents the psychological fact that the new possibility often emerges from neglected or despised parts of ourselves. Growth comes not from what we already value, but from what we have overlooked. Second, the child is typically threatened by hostile forces. Herod seeking to kill the infant Jesus, the serpent sent to kill Hercules, the Titans dismembering the infant Dionysus. This represents the psychological truth that new possibilities in the psyche are threatened by the established order, by habit, by fear of change. The old ego consciousness does not want to be displaced by new growth. Third, despite vulnerability, the child possesses miraculous powers of survival and often accomplishes impossible feats. This expresses the psychological fact that the true center of personality, the self, has resources far beyond what the ego knows. What seems impossibly fragile may prove to have remarkable resilience. Fourth, the child represents both beginning and end, the alpha and omega. The child is what comes before the origin and what comes after the future. In Jungian psychology, the emergence of the child symbol often signals a process of psychological renewal. Something new is being born in the psyche. The child as symbol of wholeness. For Jung, the child archetype is closely related to the self, the archetype of wholeness, and the goal of psychological development. The child symbol often appears when a person is on the verge of a significant psychological transformation, when something new is trying to be born in their life. The child represents wholeness because it is not yet divided. Before the development of ego consciousness, before the splits between conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, good and bad, the psyche exists in a state of original unity. The child archetype recalls this unity and points toward its recovery at a higher level through the process Jung called individuation. When child images appear in dreams, a baby, a young child, sometimes a divine or miraculous child, Jung recommends paying close attention. Such images often indicate that something new is emerging in the psyche, that a renewal is possible. The dreamer's task is to protect and nurture this new development, to give it space to grow, while not letting it be destroyed by the established patterns of the old personality. The pure eterness, the eternal child. One important aspect of the child archetype is the pure eterness, or eternal child, a term Jung borrowed from Ovid. The pure represents the positive qualities of youth, creativity, enthusiasm, imagination, idealism, but can become problematic when a person remains identified with it into adulthood. The person caught in the pure pattern remains forever young, psychologically full of potential, but never actualizing it, always beginning new projects but never finishing them, refusing to commit to any one path because that would mean closing off other possibilities. Peter Pan is the classic literary embodiment, the boy who won't grow up. Jung's student Marie-Louise von France wrote extensively about the pure eternus syndrome. The positive side is genuine, creativity, openness, the refusal to be trapped in convention. But the shadow side is a failure to engage fully with life, a fear of commitment, and a tendency to live in fantasy rather than reality. The opposite pole is the senex, the old man, representing stability, structure, tradition, but also rigidity and staleness. Psychological health requires a balance between pure and senex, between openness to the new and commitment to the established, between youthful enthusiasm and mature wisdom. Part 5. The core maiden archetype. The maiden, symbol of feminine becoming. The core, Greek for maiden or young woman, is the feminine counterpart to the child archetype. In mythology, she is represented by figures like Persephone, whose Greek title is simply core, the daughter who descends into the underworld and returns transformed. The core archetype represents the feminine principle in its youthful, innocent, and potentially transformable aspect. The myth of Demeter and Persephone is the central story of the core archetype. Persephone, the maiden daughter of Demeter, the mother, is abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter's grief causes the earth to become barren. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of the year in the underworld and part on Earth, giving rise to the seasons. This myth is rich in psychological meaning. The maiden's descent to the underworld represents the necessary journey into the depths of the psyche, into the darkness of the unconscious. It is through this descent that transformation occurs. The girl becomes a woman, the innocent becomes experienced. But it is also painful, involving a kind of death of the previous state of being. The mother-maiden pair. Jung emphasizes that the core should not be understood in isolation, but as part of a pair with the mother. Demeter and Persephone, mother and daughter, represent two aspects of a single psychological reality, the feminine psyche in its generative maturity and its youthful potential. For women, this pair represents different aspects of their own feminine nature. A woman carries within herself both the mother and the maiden, the nurturing, mature feminine, and the youthful, open, transformable feminine. Psychological development for a woman involves integrating both aspects, not getting stuck in either the eternal maiden, who never commits to maturity, or the purely maternal, who loses touch with her own continuing potential for renewal. For men, the core often appears as part of the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche. The maiden image may appear in dreams as an unknown young woman, an object of fascination and desire. She represents the man's potential for relatedness, his capacity for feeling and intuition, and the possibility of psychological renewal through connection with the feminine. The core's journey. The essential story of the core is one of transformation through descent. The maiden begins in a state of innocence and unconsciousness, closely bound to the mother. Then comes the abduction, the rape, in the original sense of seizure, the violent intrusion of experience that separates her from her mother and forces her into the underworld. This represents a necessary psychological process. To develop, one must leave the safety of the maternal realm and encounter the darkness, one's own shadow, the reality of death, the depths of the unconscious. This is often experienced as an assault, as something that happens to us rather than something we choose. The core's eating of the pomegranate seeds in the underworld is significant. By eating the food of the dead, she becomes part of that realm. She can never fully return to her previous state of innocence. Experience changes us permanently, but this is not simply negative. It is through this that she becomes queen of the underworld, gaining power and wisdom. The return from the underworld represents the integration of the experience, bringing the wisdom gained in the depths back to conscious life. The mature Persephone is no longer simply the innocent maiden. She has been initiated into the mysteries of death and transformation. Part 6. The shadow and the dark side of the psyche. What is the shadow? The shadow is perhaps the most important archetype for practical psychological work. It represents all those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, denied, or failed to develop, everything about ourselves that we don't want to see, everything that we have pushed into the unconscious, because it conflicts with our conscious self-image. Everyone has a shadow. It is an inevitable result of growing up in society. As children, we learn that certain behaviors, thoughts, and feelings are unacceptable. We learn to present a certain face to the world, what Jung calls the persona, while repressing everything that doesn't fit. The repressed material doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, forming the shadow. The shadow is not simply the bad or evil part of ourselves, though it includes our capacity for destructiveness and evil. It also includes positive qualities that we have repressed because they didn't fit our self-image or weren't acceptable in our family or culture. A person who was taught that ambition is wrong may have their natural drive and competitiveness in their shadow. A person taught that anger is always bad may have their capacity for healthy aggression and boundary setting in shadow. How the shadow manifests. The shadow makes itself known in several ways. One of the most common is through projection. Qualities that we cannot accept in ourselves, we see in others, and we react to them with disproportionate emotion. If you find yourself intensely irritated by a particular quality in another person, there's a good chance that quality exists in your own shadow. Jung captured this in a famous statement. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When we hate someone or some group with more intensity than the situation warrants, we are often projecting our own shadow onto them. The very things we find most disgusting or frightening in others are often the things we most fear and deny in ourselves. Consider some everyday examples. The person who is harshly critical of others' laziness may be repressing their own desire to rest and take it easy. The moralist who campaigns most vigorously against sexual perversion may be struggling with their own unacknowledged desires. The person who constantly accuses others of being controlling may be unaware of their own controlling tendencies. These are not coincidences, but rather the operation of the shadow through projection. The shadow also appears in dreams, often as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, a threatening or despised figure, a criminal, a beggar, a primitive person. The dream shadow represents the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. Recurring dreams of being chased often involve the shadow we are running from parts of ourselves that want to be acknowledged and integrated. In one classic example from Jung's practice, a respectable professional man dreamed repeatedly of a dirty, dangerous criminal figure pursuing him through dark streets. Through analysis, it emerged that this shadow figure represented the man's own repressed aggression, ambition, and sexuality, all the uncivilized aspects of himself that he had learned to suppress to become a respectable member of society. The dream stopped when he began to acknowledge and integrate these aspects of himself. The shadow can also erupt in uncontrolled ways, particularly under stress or when we're intoxicated. The normally mild-mannered person who becomes aggressive when drunk is expressing shadow material. The outburst of rage that came out of nowhere came from the shadow. The affair that just happened was enabled by shadow forces that overwhelmed the conscious intentions. We often see shadow eruptions at moments of transition or crisis. The model citizen who, facing a midlife crisis, suddenly abandons their family for a completely different life is often acting out long-repressed shadow contents. The accumulated pressure of unlived life breaks through the carefully constructed persona. Jung emphasized that the shadow is not inherently evil, it is simply everything we have not developed or have rejected. In fact, the shadow often contains gold. A person who has always been nice and accommodating may have valuable assertiveness in their shadow. A person who has always been serious and responsible may have creativity and playfulness in their shadow. The shadow holds not only our demons, but also our angels, the positive potentials we have failed to develop. The necessity of shadow work. Jung considered the encounter with the shadow to be the first major task of psychological development in adulthood. Before one can progress further on the path of individuation, one must first acknowledge and begin to integrate the shadow. This is difficult work because it means facing parts of ourselves that we have spent a lifetime denying. Shadow work involves several stages. First, one must recognize that one has a shadow, that one is not simply the conscious self-image, that there are repressed and denied aspects of personality. This recognition is itself challenging because the ego's defense mechanisms are designed precisely to keep shadow material out of awareness. Second, one must begin to identify specific shadow contents. This can be done through attention to projections, who irritates or fascinates you beyond reason, through dream analysis, what shadow figures appear in your dreams, through reflection on one's own unexpected or embarrassing behaviors, where did that come from, and through honest feedback from others. Third, one must acknowledge and take responsibility for the shadow contents. This doesn't mean acting them out. A person who recognizes murderous rage in their shadow doesn't need to murder anyone. But they do need to acknowledge that they are capable of such feelings, that this is part of who they are. This acknowledgement takes the power out of the shadow material. It is the unacknowledged shadow that is most dangerous. Fourth, one must find constructive ways to express and integrate shadow energies. The repressed aggression might be channeled into competitive sports or professional ambition. The denied creativity might find expression in art or hobbies. The shadow is not simply to be eliminated, but to be made conscious and put to constructive use. The collective shadow. Jung also recognized that groups, nations, and cultures have collective shadows, qualities that the group denies about itself and projects onto others. This concept has proven tremendously useful for understanding prejudice, scapegoating, and intergroup conflict. When a society defines itself in terms of certain virtues, it tends to project the opposite qualities onto outgroups. A society that prides itself on rationality may project irrationality onto minorities. A nation that defines itself as peace-loving may project aggression onto its enemies. This collective shadow projection is responsible for some of humanity's worst atrocities. Jung witnessed the collective shadow of Europe erupt in 2 world wars and saw how easily civilized people could be swept into barbarism. His psychology of the shadow was in part an attempt to understand how this could happen and how it might be prevented. The answer, he believed, lay in individual shadow work. If enough individuals could recognize and take responsibility for their own shadows, the collective projections might lose their power. The persona, the mask we wear. Before leaving the topic of the shadow, we should discuss its complement, the persona. The persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by Roman actors, is the face we present to the world, our social mask, our public self. The persona is not inherently negative. We all need a persona to navigate social life. Different situations require different presentations of self. We behave differently at work than at home, differently with strangers than with intimate friends. The persona allows us to function in society without exposing our entire inner life to everyone we meet. However, problems arise when we identify too completely with our persona, when we mistake the mask for the face. The person who has become entirely identified with their role as doctor, executive, or parent has lost touch with who they are apart from that role. When the role is threatened or lost through retirement, job loss, divorce, such a person may experience a devastating identity crisis because they have nothing beneath the persona. The persona and the shadow exist in a complementary relationship. Whatever qualities we build into our persona, the opposite qualities tend to accumulate in the shadow. The person whose persona is all sweetness and agreeableness may have considerable hostility in their shadow. The person whose persona is all toughness and independence may have a deep need for connection hiding in their shadow. Shadow work involves not only acknowledging what is in the shadow, but also loosening identification with the persona. As we integrate the shadow, the persona becomes more flexible, less of a rigid mask, and more of a useful tool that we can put on and take off as circumstances require. Part 7. The Anima and Animus. The Contrasexual Archetypes. Jung proposed that every man carries within his psyche an unconscious feminine element, which he called the anima, and every woman carries an unconscious masculine element, called the animus. These contrasexual archetypes play a crucial role in psychological development and in relationships between men and women. The concept arises from several observations. First, biologically, both men and women carry genes from both parents and produce both male and female hormones, albeit in different proportions. We are all, in a sense, biologically bisexual. Second, psychologically, qualities that cultures designate as masculine or feminine, such as rationality, aggression, nurturing, receptivity, are present in all humans, though they may be developed to different degrees. Third, in dreams and fantasies, figures of the opposite sex often appear with a numinous quality suggesting their archetypal nature. The anima in men. The anima is a man's unconscious feminine side. It includes all those qualities conventionally designated as feminine that the man has not developed or has repressed in his conscious personality. Emotionality, relatedness, receptivity, intuition, the capacity for intimacy. The anima is shaped by a man's experiences with women, especially his mother and other early feminine figures. But it is not simply a reflection of these experiences. It is an archetype, a universal pattern that exists prior to experience. Personal experiences fill in the archetypal pattern with specific content, but the pattern itself is inherited. The anima appears in dreams as female figures, sometimes familiar women, sometimes unknown. The dream anima may appear as a seductress, a goddess, a witch, a nurturing helper, a mysterious stranger. The way she appears often indicates the man's relationship with his own feminine side. Jung described 4 developmental stages of the anima, represented by different types of feminine figures. The first is Eve, the purely biological, instinctual feminine, connected to fertility and physical attraction. The second is Helen of Troy, romantic, aesthetic, personifying beauty and attraction, but still mainly projected outward. The third is Mary, spiritual love, devotion, the capacity for genuine relationship. The fourth is Sophia, wisdom, the fully integrated feminine that combines spirituality with a deep knowledge of human nature. A man's relationship with his anima is crucial for his psychological development. An unconscious or poorly developed anima leaves a man cut off from his feelings, unable to form deep relationships, and prone to projecting the anima onto actual women, expecting them to be goddesses or witches rather than real human beings. The man who falls obsessively in love or who idealizes and then devalues women is in the grip of anima projection. The animus in women. The animus is a woman's unconscious masculine side. It includes qualities conventionally designated as masculine rationality, assertiveness, the capacity for abstract thought, the ability to take decisive action. Jung characterized the animus as representing logos, or the principle of logic and meaning, whereas the anima represents eros, or the principle of relatedness. The animus is shaped by a woman's experiences with men, especially her father. It appears in dreams as male figures a stranger, a father figure, an authority, a lover, a guide. Jung saw the animus as different in structure from the anima. While the anima tends to appear as a single figure, though she may have multiple aspects, the animus often appears as a plurality, a group of men representing collective opinion, conventional wisdom, or abstract principles. When a woman says they say, or everyone knows, she may be channeling an unconscious animus rather than her own judgment. A negative or unintegrated animus can manifest as rigid opinions, harsh judgments, especially self-judgments, an inability to connect with one's own feelings, or projection onto men of either idealized or degraded masculine images. The woman in the grip of negative animus possession becomes opinionated, argumentative, and disconnected from her own instincts and feelings. A positive, integrated animus gives a woman access to her own capacity for rational thought, assertive action, and connection to meaning and principle. Rather than being ruled by collective opinion, she can think for herself. Rather than being passive or manipulative, she can act directly to achieve her goals. Anima, animus in relationships. The anima and animus play a crucial role in heterosexual romantic relationships. When we fall in love, we often project our contrasexual archetype onto the other person. The beloved seems to glow with a magical light because we are seeing in them our own soul image. This projection is both the source of romantic love's intensity and the cause of many relationship problems. The projection inevitably breaks down as we get to know the real person, who can never fully embody our ideal. The challenge of relationship is to withdraw the projection, accept the other person as they actually are, and integrate the contrasexual archetype within ourselves rather than seeking it in the other. Jung's analysis of anima and animus has been influential, but also controversial. Some critics argue that it is based on outdated gender stereotypes. Jung's characterization of the anima as emotional and the animus as rational reflects the gender assumptions of his time and place. Modern Jungians often approach these concepts with more flexibility, recognizing that individuals of any gender may have variously configured contrasexual elements. Part 8. The self and individuation. The self, center and totality. The self is, in Jung's system, the most important archetype, the archetype of wholeness, the center and totality of the psyche. It is both the goal of psychological development and the guiding principle that directs development. The self includes both conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, masculine and feminine aspects. It is the whole person in potential. Jung distinguishes carefully between the ego and the self. The ego is the center of consciousness, our sense of I, our conscious identity. It is what we normally think of as ourselves, but the ego is only a small part of the total psyche. The self includes the ego but encompasses much more, all of the unconscious contents, all the unrealized potentials, the totality of who we are and might become. An analogy might help. Imagine you're in a small boat on a vast ocean. The boat is the ego. It's where you live, it's what you're immediately aware of, it's your navigable space in the world. But the boat floats on the ocean, which is vastly larger and mostly unknown. The ocean is the unconscious. The self would be both boat and ocean together, the total reality of your existence. Symbols of the self. Because the self transcends consciousness, it cannot be fully grasped by the ego. We can only know the self through its symbols, images that point toward it without fully capturing it. Jung found that certain symbols appear again and again in dreams, myths, and religious traditions as representations of the self. The most common symbol of the self is the mandala, a circular design, often with fourfold symmetry, representing wholeness and integration. Mandalas appear in the religious art of many traditions: the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, Tibetan sand paintings, Native American sand paintings, Hindu yantras. They also appear spontaneously in the dreams and drawings of modern people with no knowledge of these traditions. Jung saw the prevalence of mandala imagery as evidence for the archetypal nature of the self. Other symbols of the self include divine figures, Christ, Buddha, and other savior figures who represent the fully realized human being. The divine child, as discussed earlier, is a symbol of the self in its aspect of new birth and potential. The hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, the union of king and queen, masculine and feminine, represents the self as the union of opposites. Geometric symbols of the self include the circle, the square, the quaternary, fourfold pattern, and the combination of circle and square. The philosopher's stone of alchemy, which Jung studied extensively, is a symbol of the self as the goal of psychological transformation. Individuation, the journey to wholeness. Individuation is Jung's term for the process of psychological development that leads toward the self. It is the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, distinct from the collective, fully themselves in a way that integrates all aspects of the psyche. Individuation is not the same as individualism or self-centeredness. Paradoxically, as we become more truly individual, more fully ourselves, we also become more related to others and to the world. The person who has not individuated is often more self-centered because they are identified with their ego. The individuating person, in contact with the self, is connected to the larger reality that includes others. The process of individuation typically involves several stages, though these are not necessarily sequential and may overlap. First comes the confrontation with the shadow, recognizing and integrating the denied aspects of the personality. Then comes the encounter with the anima or animus, integrating the contrasexual archetype. Beyond this lies the encounter with other archetypal figures and ultimately with the self. The first half of life. Jung distinguished between the psychological tasks of life's first and second halves. In the first half of life, roughly until the late 30s or early 40s, the main task is establishing oneself in the world. This involves developing a strong ego, building a persona, social identity, achieving external goals like career, family, and social position, and generally becoming a functioning adult in society. During this period, one-sidedness is often necessary. To succeed professionally, one may need to develop certain skills at the expense of others. To fit into society, one may need to suppress aspects of oneself that don't fit. The shadow grows as a natural consequence of the adaptations required by life. The midlife transition. Around midlife, many people experience a crisis. The goals that motivated the first half of life lose their power to satisfy. Success feels hollow. Questions of meaning become pressing. Old ways of being no longer work. This is not merely a crisis, but an opportunity, the psyche's way of calling attention to unlived life, to the shadow, to the need for a new direction. This midlife transition is often marked by eruptions of the unconscious, vivid dreams, unexpected emotions, attraction to new interests and people, a sense of mortality and the passing of time. What had been neglected in the rush toward external achievement now demands attention. The second half of life. The second half of life, Jung argued, has different tasks than the first. Where the first half is about establishing oneself, the second is about finding meaning. Where the first is about building an ego, the second is about transcending ego-centeredness. Where the first involves adaptation to the external world, the second involves attention to the inner world. This does not mean abandoning practical responsibilities or withdrawing from life. Rather, it means living with a different orientation, less identified with external roles and achievements, more connected to inner sources of meaning. The individuating person in the second half of life continues to participate in the world, but is no longer wholly defined by their participation. Individuation is not something that can be achieved once and for all. It is an ongoing process, a lifelong journey. Jung believed it typically becomes a pressing concern in the second half of life, when external achievements lose their power to satisfy and deeper questions of meaning come to the fore. But the seeds of individuation are present from the beginning. What individuation looks like? An individuating person gradually becomes more whole, more rounded, more balanced. They recognize and integrate their shadow rather than projecting it onto others. They develop their inferior function and access the contrasexual archetype. They become less identified with their persona and more authentic. They experience moments of connection with the self-experiences of meaning, wholeness, and guidance from within. At the same time, individuation does not produce perfect people. Jung was clear that individuation means becoming who you actually are, not who you should be. An individuating person remains flawed and limited, but they know their flaws and limitations rather than denying them. They are real rather than artificial, honest rather than pretending to be something they're not. Jung also emphasized that individuation is individual, there is no one-size-fits-all template. Each person must find their own path, guided by their own dreams and experiences. What constitutes wholeness for one person may not be the same for another. The goal is not conformity to an ideal, but the realization of one's unique potential. The ego-self axis. Central to Jung's model of development is the relationship between the ego and the self, sometimes called the ego-self axis. Healthy psychological development requires that the ego maintain a connection to the self while not being overwhelmed by it. Two pathologies result from disturbances in this relationship. If the ego is disconnected from the self, the result is alienation, meaninglessness, and depression. Life seems empty because the ego has lost touch with the deeper sources of meaning in the unconscious. If the ego is overwhelmed by or identified with the self, a state Jung calls inflation, the result can range from grandiosity and narcissism to psychosis. The person who believes they are Christ or Napoleon has confused their ego with the self. The healthy relationship involves the ego serving as a kind of intermediary between the conscious world and the unconscious self. The ego maintains its boundaries and its practical function of navigating the outer world, while remaining open to guidance and numinous experience from the self. This is the position Jung advocated, neither an inflated identification with the archetypes nor a defensive disconnection from them. Part 9. Symbols and their psychological function. The nature of symbols. Jung drew a crucial distinction between signs and symbols. A sign is something that stands for a known thing. A traffic light is a sign whose meaning we understand completely. A symbol, in Jung's specific sense, is something that points to a reality that cannot be fully captured. In rational terms, it expresses something that is in part unknown or unknowable. Symbols emerge from the unconscious as the best possible expression of something not yet clearly understood. When we dream of a mysterious figure or are moved by a religious image, we are encountering symbols, images that carry meaning beyond what we can consciously articulate. The power of symbols lies precisely in this surplus of meaning. They resonate at levels deeper than rational understanding. A symbol loses its symbolic character when it is fully understood. It then becomes merely a sign. This is why Jung was critical of approaches that reduce symbols to fixed meanings. To say that a snake in a dream means penis is to treat the symbol as a sign and to lose its true significance. The snake might carry sexual significance in some contexts, but it also carries associations with wisdom, healing, danger, transformation, the earth, immortality. The symbol is overdetermined, pointing in many directions at once. The function of symbols in psychological life. Symbols serve several crucial functions in psychological life. First, they mediate between the conscious and unconscious. The unconscious cannot communicate with consciousness directly by definition. Its contents are outside awareness. But through symbols, in dreams, fantasies, slips of the tongue, artistic productions, the unconscious can make itself known. Second, symbols unite opposites. Rational thought works through distinctions and oppositions, good or bad, light or dark, masculine or feminine. But the psyche's deeper tendency is toward wholeness, which requires a reconciliation of opposites. Symbols can hold together what rational thought must separate. The yin-yang symbol, for example, represents the interpenetration of masculine and feminine, light and dark, a truth that cannot be captured in rational propositions but can be grasped through the symbol. Third, symbols have a transformative power. Jung described the symbol as a transformer of energy. Psychological energy, libido, that is stuck in one pattern can be released and redirected through engagement with the appropriate symbol. This is why religious rituals, art, and dreams can have such profound effects. They engage the symbolic function and enable psychological transformation. Fourth, symbols create meaning. In a world that can seem arbitrary and meaningless, symbols connect us to deeper patterns. The person who engages with symbols, whether through religious practice, artistic creation, dream work, or other means, lives in a meaningful universe. Archetypal symbols in dreams. Dreams are the primary source of symbolic material for most people. Every night, the unconscious produces a stream of imagery that expresses its contents in symbolic form. Jung devoted enormous attention to dream interpretation, seeing it as one of the main tools for exploring the unconscious. Jung's approach to dreams differed from Freud's in important ways. While Freud saw dreams primarily as disguised wish fulfillments, with the dream content concealing a hidden meaning, Jung saw dreams as direct expressions of the unconscious that say exactly what they mean. The difficulty is that they speak in the language of symbols, which the conscious mind must learn to understand. The compensatory function of dreams. Jung believed that dreams serve a compensatory function. They balance or correct the one-sidedness of conscious attitudes. If you are too confident about something in your waking life, your dreams may present images of danger or failure. If you are too pessimistic, dreams may offer images of hope and possibility. The unconscious, through dreams, works to maintain psychological equilibrium. This compensatory function can be seen in many common dream themes. The successful executive dreams of failure, the shy person dreams of public triumph, the person in a happy relationship dreams of infidelity. These are not predictions or wishes, but compensations, the unconscious presenting the other side of the conscious attitude. The perspective function of dreams. Jung also emphasized the perspective or forward-looking function of dreams. While dreams may reference the past, they often point toward future possibilities. They show the direction the psyche is trying to move. A dream of being trapped might reveal not just past traumas, but the psyche's current experience of limitation and its desire for liberation. Dreams often anticipate life transitions before the conscious mind is aware of them. A woman approaching a major career change may dream of journeys or crossroads. A man about to enter a new relationship may dream of an unknown woman. The unconscious seems to perceive and prepare for changes before they become conscious. Big dreams and ordinary dreams. Archetypal dreams. Dreams that contain clearly archetypal imagery are of particular importance. These big dreams, as Jung called them, often occur at significant life transitions and can have a powerful impact. They feel different from ordinary dreams, more vivid, more significant, easier to remember. Their imagery often connects to mythological or religious themes that the dreamer may not consciously know. Jung distinguished between big dreams and ordinary dreams. Ordinary dreams deal with personal matters, the residue of daily life, personal conflicts, and wishes. Big dreams have a different quality. They feel numinous, they contain clearly archetypal imagery, they are remembered for years or even a lifetime. In traditional societies, big dreams were often shared with the community and treated as significant events. Approaching your dreams. For those interested in working with their own dreams, Jung recommended several principles. First, record your dreams immediately upon waking, before they fade. Keep a dream journal by your bed. Even fragments are valuable. Second, approach the dream with respect and curiosity rather than trying to immediately interpret it. Sit with the images. Notice what feelings they evoke. Avoid rushing to conclusions about what the dream means. Third, consider the context. What was happening in your life when you had the dream? What concerns were you carrying to bed? The dream responds to your life situation. Fourth, work with the images through amplification, gathering associations, myths, and cultural parallels that connect to the dream images. If you dream of a snake, consider what snakes have meant across cultures. Wisdom, healing, danger, transformation, the feminine, the earth, immortality. Let the symbol expand rather than reducing it to a single meaning. Fifth, consider the dream as a whole and the relationships between its elements. Dreams have a structure, often with a beginning, the setting, a development, the action, a culmination, the crisis or turning point, and a lysis, the outcome or resolution. What story is the dream telling? Finally, ask what the dream might be compensating for, what it might be pointing toward, what it might be asking you to consider. The dream is not a problem to be solved, but a message to be heard. Part 10. Practical applications and therapeutic implications. Analytical psychology as therapy. Jung developed his theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious not merely as an academic exercise, but as a practical tool for psychological healing. Jungian analysis, the therapeutic approach based on Jung's work, uses these concepts to help people understand themselves better, resolve inner conflicts, and move toward psychological wholeness. How Jungian analysis differs. The therapeutic relationship in Jungian analysis is different from classical psychoanalysis. Jung emphasized that the analyst must also be engaged in their own process of individuation. Therapy is a meeting of two psyches, not a healthy doctor treating a sick patient. The analyst's unconscious is involved just as much as the patient's. Jung also rejected the idea of the analyst as a blank screen onto which the patient projects. He believed in a more mutual, dialectical relationship in which both parties are affected and potentially transformed. The analyst brings their own humanity to the encounter, not hiding behind professional neutrality. Jungian analysis tends to be less focused on childhood trauma and more interested in current life situations and future possibilities. While the past is important, Jung was more interested in the question, what is the unconscious trying to accomplish now? Than in tracing everything back to early experience. The analytic container. Jungian analysts speak of creating a temenos, or sacred space for the analytic work, a container within which unconscious contents can safely emerge. This involves regularity, same time, same place, confidentiality, and the analyst's consistent presence and attention. Within this container, material can surface that might otherwise remain unconscious. The main tools of Jungian analysis include dream interpretation, active imagination, a technique for engaging with unconscious contents while in a waking state, and analysis of the transference, the feelings and projections that arise in the therapeutic relationship. Through these methods, the patient comes to know their unconscious, to integrate the shadow, to encounter the anima or animus, and to move toward the self, who benefits from Jungian analysis. Jungian analysis is not for everyone. It tends to appeal to people who are interested in meaning and depth, who are willing to engage in self-exploration over an extended period, and who have some stability in their lives that allows for this kind of inner work. It may be particularly suited to people in the second half of life who are grappling with questions of meaning and purpose. It is less suited to acute crisis situations where rapid symptom relief is needed, or to people who want practical problem-solving without exploring deeper patterns. For these situations, other therapeutic approaches may be more appropriate. Active imagination. Active imagination is a technique Jung developed for engaging with the unconscious while awake. Unlike dream interpretation, which works with material that has already been produced by the unconscious during sleep, active imagination is a deliberate entering into dialogue with unconscious contents. How active imagination works. The technique involves focusing on an image from a dream or fantasy and allowing it to develop spontaneously. The ego remains present and observant, but does not control the development. It lets the unconscious unfold while maintaining a witnessing awareness. The resulting imagery can then be recorded in writing, drawing, painting, or other creative forms. To practice active imagination, one typically begins by relaxing in a quiet space, free from distractions. One then focuses on a starting image, perhaps a figure from a dream, a spontaneous fantasy, or a feeling that can be visualized as an image. The key is to observe without directing, to let the image move and change on its own, to let figures speak without putting words in their mouths, to let the unconscious lead while the ego follows and witnesses. The process often takes the form of a dialogue. One might ask a dream figure questions and wait for answers to arise spontaneously. One might observe the figure's actions and respond to them. The goal is genuine interaction with the unconscious, not the ego creating a fantasy that confirms what it already believes. The value of the technique. Active imagination allows for a more direct engagement with archetypes than dream interpretation alone. By entering into the imaginal world and interacting with the figures encountered there, a person can develop a relationship with their unconscious contents rather than simply analyzing them from the outside. Jung used active imagination extensively in his own life, particularly during his confrontation with the unconscious following his break with Freud. The visions and dialogues he recorded in his Red Book were products of active imagination. Many artists and writers have used similar techniques, whether or not they called it by Jung's name. Cautions and limitations. Jung cautioned that active imagination is not suitable for everyone. People with weak ego structures, those prone to psychosis, or those unable to maintain the distinction between imaginal experience and external reality should approach this technique with great caution or not at all. It requires a strong ego to engage with archetypal material without being overwhelmed. There is a crucial difference between active imagination and mere fantasy. In passive fantasy, the ego takes over and creates whatever it wants wish fulfillment daydreams, for example. In active imagination, the ego holds back and lets the unconscious lead. This distinction is subtle but important. Genuine active imagination often surprises the ego, presenting material that the conscious mind would never have invented. Applications beyond therapy. Jung's ideas have found applications far beyond the consulting room. His concepts of archetypes and the collective unconscious have influenced many fields, including literature and literary criticism, film theory, religious studies, anthropology and art, storytelling and film. In storytelling and screenwriting, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model, which drew heavily on Jung, has become enormously influential. Campbell's insight that mythological stories around the world share a common structure: the hero leaves the ordinary world, faces trials, and returns transformed, has been applied to countless films and novels. George Lucas explicitly based Star Wars on Campbell's model, and screenwriting manuals like Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey have made the hero's journey a standard tool in Hollywood. But Jung's influence on storytelling goes beyond the hero's journey. Understanding archetypes helps explain why certain characters and stories resonate so deeply. The wise mentor, the shape-shifting trickster, the shadow antagonist, the anima figure as love interest, these recur in stories because they tap into archetypal patterns. Writers who understand archetypes can create more resonant, meaningful stories. Religious studies and spirituality. In religious studies, Jung's work has provided a psychological framework for understanding religious experience. Rather than reducing religion to illusion or neurosis, as Freud did, Jung saw religious symbols as genuine expressions of archetypal reality. His approach allows for a sympathetic psychological study of religion that takes religious experience seriously. Jung was particularly interested in the psychological meaning of Christian symbolism, Eastern religions, especially alchemy and Gnosticism, and the religions of indigenous peoples. He saw these diverse traditions as different cultural expressions of the same underlying archetypal realities. This comparative approach has influenced scholars of religion and has provided resources for interfaith dialogue. For many contemporary spiritual seekers, Jung provides a framework for engaging with religious and spiritual questions without having to commit to traditional doctrines. His psychology of religion allows one to take spiritual experience seriously as psychologically real and meaningful, even if one remains agnostic about metaphysical claims. Marketing and branding. Perhaps surprisingly, Jung's ideas have also influenced marketing and branding. The concept of brand archetypes, the idea that successful brands embody archetypal patterns that consumers recognize and respond to, draws on Jung's psychology. A brand might be positioned as the hero, Nike, the caregiver, Johnson & Johnson, the rebel, Harley-Davidson, or the sage, Google. Understanding archetypes helps marketers create emotionally resonant brand identities. While some might see this as a degradation of Jung's ideas, it illustrates their practical power. Archetypes work, they evoke emotional responses and create meaning, whether we're talking about ancient myths or modern advertisements. In personal development, Jung's concepts have influenced various approaches to self-understanding and growth. Concepts like the shadow, the persona, and individuation have entered popular culture, providing people with tools for self-reflection even outside formal therapy. Working with archetypes in daily life. One need not be in Jungian analysis to benefit from understanding archetypes. Simply knowing about these patterns can help us understand our own experience and our relationships with others. Recognizing our projections is one practical application. When we find ourselves having intense emotional reactions to others, whether attraction or repulsion, we can ask ourselves whether we might be projecting our own shadow or contrasexual archetype onto them. This recognition doesn't eliminate the projection, but it can help us disentangle our issues from our perceptions of others. Paying attention to dreams is another accessible practice. Even without extensive training in dream interpretation, simply recording dreams and reflecting on their imagery can deepen self-understanding. Recurring images and themes often point to archetypal content seeking attention. Engaging with mythology, art, and literature can also be a form of archetypal work. When we are moved by a story or image, we are experiencing the activation of an archetype. Reflecting on why certain stories or images resonate with us can reveal aspects of our own psychology. Part 11, Critical Analysis and Modern Relevance. Strengths of Jung's theory. Jung's theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious has several notable strengths. First, it provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the universality of human experience. The remarkable similarities in myths, symbols, and religious themes across unconnected cultures demand some explanation. Jung offers one. Second, Jung's approach honors the depth and complexity of the human psyche. Unlike reductionist approaches that explain psychological phenomena in terms of simpler underlying causes, Jung preserves the richness and mystery of inner experience. Dreams are not just random neural firing. Symbols are not just cultural constructs. Religious experiences are not just wish fulfillment or neurosis. Third, Jung offers a positive vision of psychological development. Rather than focusing primarily on pathology and neurosis, Jungian psychology is oriented toward growth, meaning, and the realization of potential. The concept of individuation provides a goal for psychological development that extends beyond the mere absence of symptoms. Fourth, Jung's work bridges psychology and the humanities. His extensive study of mythology, religion, alchemy, and other symbolic traditions creates connections between psychology and the larger cultural heritage of humanity. This interdisciplinary richness has made Jung's work appealing to scholars in many fields. Fifth, phenomenologically, Jung's concepts resonate. When people learn about the shadow, the anima/animus, or the process of individuation, they often recognize these patterns in their own experience. This experiential validation, while not scientific proof, suggests that Jung captured something real about human psychology. Criticisms and limitations. Jung's theories have also been subject to significant criticism, which any serious student should consider. The most fundamental criticism concerns scientific verifiability. The collective unconscious is, by definition, not directly observable. The evidence for it is interpretive. The similarity of myths can be explained in other ways: diffusion, common human situations, convergent cultural evolution, and the appearance of archetypal images in dreams and psychosis might be explained without positing a collective unconscious. Critics argue that Jung's theory is unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. Related to this is the question of inheritance. Jung claimed that archetypes are inherited, but the mechanism of this inheritance has never been clearly specified. Modern genetics provides no obvious way for complex psychological patterns to be transmitted across generations. Some defenders of Jung suggest that archetypes should be understood not as literally inherited, but as emergent properties of the human brain's structure, or as common responses to common human situations. Some critics see Jung's work as insufficiently attentive to social and political realities. By locating psychological problems in the individual psyche and the collective unconscious, Jungian psychology can be seen as neglecting the role of social conditions, power structures, and material circumstances in shaping psychological experience. Jung's personal history has also generated controversy. His relations with the Nazi regime in the 1930s, when he made comments that have been interpreted as anti-Semitic and served as president of a Nazified psychotherapy organization, have troubled many. While the extent of his complicity remains debated, it raises questions about the potential political implications of his theories, particularly his emphasis on the collective and on blood and soil imagery. Modern relevance and ongoing influence. Despite these criticisms, Jung's ideas continue to exert considerable influence. In clinical practice, Jungian analysis remains a vital school of psychotherapy, with training institutes around the world. Post-Jungian theorists have extended and revised Jung's ideas, addressing some of the criticisms while preserving core insights. In popular culture, Jung's influence is enormous, though often unacknowledged. The widespread use of personality typologies, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, based on Jung's theory of psychological types, is one example. The hero's journey in storytelling, personality archetypes in branding and marketing, and the general cultural vocabulary of shadow work and individuation all derive from Jung. Some modern researchers have found points of connection between Jung's ideas and contemporary cognitive science. The brain's tendency to form categories and patterns, the existence of universal facial expressions and emotional responses, and the common structures found in narratives across cultures all suggest that something like archetypes might have a neurological basis, even if not in exactly the form Jung proposed. Perhaps most importantly, in an age of meaning crisis, when traditional religious and cultural frameworks have lost their authority for many people, Jung's work offers resources for engaging with the deeper questions of existence. His approach allows for a serious engagement with myth, symbol, and the numinous without requiring adherence to any particular religious doctrine. For many contemporary seekers, Jung provides a bridge between the scientific worldview and the need for meaning. Conclusion: Carl Jung's theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious represents one of the most ambitious attempts to map the depths of the human psyche. At its core is a profound insight that we are not isolated individuals, but carriers of a shared psychological heritage that connects us to all humanity and to the deep history of our species. The archetypes, the mother, the child, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self are patterns that shape human experience in ways both subtle and profound. They appear in our dreams, in our relationships, in our creative works, and in the religious and mythological traditions of all cultures. Understanding them can illuminate aspects of our experience that otherwise remain mysterious. Think of Jung's psychology as providing a map of inner territory. Just as explorers once mapped the physical world, discovering continents and charting coastlines, Jung mapped the psychological world, the continents of the shadow, the islands of the complexes, the ocean of the collective unconscious, the distant star of the self. The map is not the territory, but it can guide us on our journey. The journey Jung describes from unconsciousness through the confrontation with shadow, the encounter with the contrasexual other, and the approach to the self is a map for psychological development that many have found useful. It offers an alternative to both a naive optimism that ignores the darkness in human nature and a cynical pessimism that sees no possibility of growth or meaning. This journey is not easy. Facing the shadow means acknowledging everything we have tried to deny about ourselves. Encountering the anima or animus means surrendering the comfortable notion that we are complete as we are. Approaching the self means letting go of ego-centered existence and opening to something larger. Each step requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to be changed. But the rewards are proportionate to the difficulties. Those who undertake this journey report a greater sense of wholeness, a deeper connection to meaning, a more authentic way of being in the world. They become less driven by unconscious compulsions and more able to respond to life with freedom and creativity. They become, in the deepest sense, themselves. Jung's theories are not beyond criticism, and a thoughtful engagement with them requires acknowledging their limitations. They are difficult to verify scientifically. They reflect cultural assumptions of their time. They may underestimate social and material factors in psychological life. These criticisms deserve serious consideration. Yet there is something in Jung's work that continues to speak to people across generations and cultures. Perhaps it is the sense that human life has a depth and meaning that cannot be fully captured in rational terms. Perhaps it is the intuition that the images in our dreams and the stories that move us are not arbitrary, but connect to something fundamental about what it means to be human. Perhaps it is simply the power of Jung's writing, his ability to evoke the numinous dimension of experience. In our contemporary world, Jung's ideas may be more relevant than ever. We live in an age characterized by what some have called a meaning crisis. Traditional religious and cultural frameworks have lost their authority for many people, leaving a vacuum that is often filled by shallow entertainment, consumerism, or destructive ideologies. Jung's psychology offers a way to engage with depth, meaning, and the sacred without requiring adherence to any particular religious doctrine. We also live in an age of polarization, in which groups demonize each other with increasing intensity. Jung's concept of the shadow helps us understand this phenomenon. The qualities we project onto our enemies are often the qualities we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. Shadow work at both individual and collective levels may be essential for healing our divided societies. And we live in an age of distraction, in which the demands of technology and the pace of modern life leave little room for reflection and inner exploration. Jung's emphasis on dreams, on the inner world, on the importance of attending to the psyche, offers a counterbalance to our externally focused culture. Whatever the source of its appeal, Jung's psychology of archetypes and the collective unconscious remains a vital resource for self-understanding. It invites us to look beyond the surface of our daily concerns to the deeper patterns that shape our lives. It challenges us to face our shadows, to integrate what we have rejected, to become more fully who we are. It points toward a wholeness that is both the origin and the goal of human existence. Living with Jungian ideas doesn't necessarily mean becoming a Jungian analyst or spending years in formal analysis. It can mean simply cultivating awareness of the archetypal dimension of life, noticing when you're projecting your shadow, paying attention to your dreams, recognizing the power of symbols and images, honoring the journey toward wholeness even when it's difficult. It means approaching yourself with curiosity rather than judgment, recognizing that you are more than your conscious self-image. It means taking the inner life seriously not as an escape from reality, but as another dimension of reality, equally important as the outer world. It means being willing to change, to grow, to become who you are meant to be. Jung himself was modest about the ultimate status of his theories. He often said he was not proposing metaphysical truths, but psychological models maps that might help us navigate the territory of the psyche. The map is not the territory, but a good map can be invaluable for the journey. For those who engage seriously with Jung's ideas, the reward is not certainty, but depth, a richer, more textured experience of what it means to be human. In a world that often seems to flatten experience to the merely material, Jung's psychology preserves the dimension of depth. That may be its greatest gift. The archetypes have always been with us. They were present in the cave paintings of our ancestors, in the myths told around ancient fires, in the dreams of medieval peasants and modern professionals alike. They will continue to shape human experience as long as there are humans to experience. Jung's great achievement was to bring this timeless dimension of human existence into conscious awareness, to give us a language for talking about what had always been felt but rarely understood. Whether or not you accept every detail of Jung's theory, engaging with his ideas can deepen your self-understanding and enrich your experience of life. The shadow, the anima, the animus, the self, these are not just abstract concepts, but living realities within each of us, waiting to be recognized and integrated. The journey of individuation is not a luxury for the privileged few, but the birthright and the task of every human being. As Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakes." The journey into the collective unconscious is a journey of awakening to the depths within ourselves, to our connection with all humanity, and to the archetypal patterns that give shape and meaning to human existence. It is a journey that each person must take for themselves, but it is one that has been taken by countless others before, guided by the same stars.